UConn to the Big 12? Can't say I didn't warn you. You're Locked On UConn.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank you for your continued support. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button at the bottom of your screen, click it, and make sure you follow us on all of your favorite audio platforms. Your subscriptions, likes, comments really help us grow and continue to bring the best UConn content out there. We appreciate each and every one of you tuning in. Today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate GM. Ultimate College Football HC is a brand new mobile game that is completely free, has no ads, and is 100% playable offline. Use the promo code Locked On College Football, Locked On CFB, all caps inside the game to receive a free boost to your program. Begin your coaching legacy today. Well, the legacy of UConn may be altered forever in the very few short coming days. And I don't know, was there some big news that dropped on Friday? You know, the one about UConn and the Big 12? I seem to recall mentions that on Tuesday, when I brought this up on a Locked On Big 12 crossover show, that it was just, clickbait. You have no sources. Well, here we are. And Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark is ready to present the proposal to the league's presidents tomorrow. A 3/4 majority vote, 12 out of the 16 members, is required for an expansion approval. A source close to me, yes, the same source that said this was happening and that it was imminent, has said, while there are still challenges, this is a direct quote from him, to iron out, Yormark believes he has the 12 votes necessary to add UConn for 2026. With all sports and football as a full member in 2031. Thus, the reason UConn officials have met with them to show their commitment to this process. It's now in Brett's hands to deliver the proposal, which I'm told has already curried favor simply because you get the basketball brand first. And the secondary point, which is that it's a calculated risk that UConn football gets competitive in 7 years. It's a long time. UConn has already made a considerable amount of investments in football to get it to where it needs to be, I guess, competitive. In the schedule that they have, they're doing a good job of bringing on legit coaches, staff members. The facilities are better, and NIL is getting to the point where we can be competitive in the independent and small time. So it's going to take a little while for that to be built up. UConn would join the Big 12 in all sports except football, with the latest potential start date being 2026, could be sooner. This move would unite UConn's elite basketball programs, obviously the men and women, with the Big 12. UConn football would obviously join in 2031, and upon the school meeting with specific investment thresholds. We just talked about the investments they've already made. I have not been privy, nor has my source been privy to those details, but I've seen some leaks that include investments in Rensselaer Field, although the lease is up in 2028. I saw some people floating out and maybe a stadium on campus. Those are all conjecture at this point, but the attendance numbers significantly have to improve. This timeline aligns with the start of the Big 12's new television deal. The Big 12 is a year away from beginning a new 6-year deal with ESPN and Fox that will pay its members an average of $31.7 million per year. The deal was agreed to before the former Pac-12 schools, 12 editions, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah. But ESPN was required to pay a pro-rate share for the Power 5 members. UConn, however, would not be guaranteed that same deal. In some of the articles that I've read, including one with Ross Dillinger, who will be on our show tomorrow, has described it as a budget neutral, which means that other members of the conference wouldn't see a reduced revenue payout with UConn again, joining football until 2031. So just think of those potential matchups. So digest all of that. So what that means essentially is that UConn is coming in and saying, we're going to create a better basketball brand by bringing the best basketball program in the country in both the men's and the women's Arguably, South Carolina might be better present day, but of all time, UConn's women's basketball is the best ever. And UConn men is the best basketball program of the last 35 years. Easily creates a super conference of basketball powers. So just think about those potential matchups. Going out to Arizona, playing Tommy Lloyd and those guys. A Hurley primetime game with Danny's brother Bobby in Arizona State. Houston and Calvin Sampson. A home with Kansas in Old Big East foe West Virginia. Plus, you're kidding yourself if you want to travel to Boulder and see how beautiful that campus is. UConn versus Kansas in basketball would easily become the best conference game of the college basketball slate every year, year in, year out. So UConn's football, which the move to the Big 12 is critical, but it's going to take some time because right now, UConn is the only independent football program in the country, excluding Notre Dame, and receives the smallest portion of revenue from the college football playoff. So let's talk about the why. This phrase isn't said because it's a cliche, because it's truly happening every day. In the quotes, right? In the ever-changing landscape of college athletics, UConn has to stay proactive. And why are we staying proactive? Because this Big 12 opportunity, because next year when revenue sharing model starts, the House has passed a law that you are going to have to share up to 22% of your revenue athletically to your players. So you're only getting about $7.2 million a year from the Big East TV rights per school. And you're making investments to facilities, new scoreboards. Meanwhile, the Big Ten and SEC schools are just continuing to grab more and more market share. And never mind the Big 12, which are getting upwards of about $80 million a year on a deal. So UConn needs to do this to mitigate the impending disaster of being left behind. You don't want to be Oregon State. You don't want to be Washington State with a 2-person Pac-12. And then what? Then our basketball program starts to suffer. Because let's face it, guys, I think the majority of people that watch this show that are fans of Connecticut are fans of UConn are basketball fans first, as I am, and football fans second. So the difference, though, and I'm going to talk to Ross Dellinger about this, about what's different this time. But what's different this time, in my opinion, is that when UConn football has to be part of the conference later on, 2031 is a long time from now. But the immediate benefit is to every other sport, including baseball, which will be ranked next year and is on the rise. Then, even though my nostalgic brain hates the thought of leaving the Big East. But what this does to our men's and women's basketball program is set them up for their future, especially the women. Gino Auriemma just signed an extension, but he's an older gentleman. Let's just call a spade a spade. I love Gino, but he won't be on the sideline forever. In women's basketball, it's at its most popular from a national perspective than ever before. A lot of you have said we're tired of seeing our UConn women, who are the best at what they do, play in little high school gyms. You don't get that in the Big 12. There's also talk about this. What I talk about the most is men's basketball. And one of the worries that people have is eventually Dan Hurley was going to leave for the NBA. He flirted with the Lakers. He doesn't have any more, what was the entire story around that? He doesn't have any more challenges in college. He's won back-to-back titles. He's created a power at UConn. What a perfect way to create another challenge for Dan Hurley is to enter into the Big 12 that is getting stronger with the addition of Arizona, to Kansas, to Houston, to Baylor, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, West Virginia. Look, we can make fun of the Big 12 and how they've had short exits this year, but they've had the last 3 national champions. If you talk about outside of UConn, if UConn was to join, then you'd have UConn. Kansas was the last national champion other than UConn. Baylor, and then Texas Tech lost to Virginia in the final in 2019. So it's not like the Big 12 hasn't had success in basketball. And it presents a tremendous challenge, which is exactly what Dan Hurley and his staff love to put a team together. And also, I don't know this because this could be just, a coincidence. But we've talked about the depth of this team this year. When this happens, you're going to need 10 guys that can play so you can manage this roster and keep everyone healthy and kind of almost do a mini load management that the NBA style does and keep them running on all cylinders so that by the end of the year, you're fresh for the tournament. So maybe this has been talked about behind the scenes a lot sooner than some of this stuff dropped, a lot sooner than my source got to me about stuff. So I am so adamant, and I'm telling you guys that this is going to happen. And if I'm wrong on this, I will 100% own it. I will come on the show, and the first thing I will say is, I was wrong. You're Locked On UConn. And then we'll talk about why I was wrong. But from everything that I've been hearing in all of the dots that I'm connecting, this is happening, and we're going to talk about it more coming up after this. Hey, Locked On UConn fans, I want to take a moment to give you a heads up on a brand new mobile game that I think you're going to love as much as I do. Ultimate College Football HC. In this amazing game and simulation, you can step into the shoes of a head coach and lead your college football program to glory. Can you imagine actually being the head coach of the UConn Huskies? From recruiting players and hiring coaches to overseeing training camps and handling school scholarships, you control every crucial detail of the program. It's all in your hands. Will you be able to handle the pressure? And here's what I really love about this game. You're responsible for calling offensive plays. Your strategy will not only determine the success of your football season, but the shape and future and legacy of your program. The Ultimate College Football HC is completely free, has no ads, and is 100% playable online. You can play on the go and as you want, and when you want to. And of course, we have a special offer for Locked On UConn fans. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCFB, all caps, inside the game store to receive a free boost to your program. And make sure to take advantage of this perk so that you will get your team off to a strong start. So download the game, visit ultimate-cfb.com, ultimate-cfb.com, or look it up on the app stores. Ultimate College Football Head Coach. Start your coaching legacy today. Okay, we're back on Locked On UConn in the big news about the Big 12 and everything that's going on. I know Twitter is about to break between UConn fans fighting about whether we should go, whether we should stay, why now? We don't want to be in the AAC again, all that stuff. But we're talking Big 12 expansion. And we're bringing in someone who has come on my radar recently, Jeff Dillon. Jeff is a pastor, writer, and lifelong UConn fan. He's covered sports as a freelance writer since 2015, discovering and sharing the greatest stories from the world of sports. And there is no better story right now than the UConn Huskies. Let's bring in Jeff to the program. Jeff Dillon, welcome. First question for you. Let's get to know you. What was your first thoughts when you heard this news drop?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. And it's good to be with the man who broke the story. Congrats on that. You were ahead of everybody else.
Appreciate that, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's been fun to talk about and think about the last week or so. And I have to admit, I think, a year ago when this was kind of heating up, I wasn't sure about it. I thought, man, we just got settled back in the Big East. We're having so much success in the Big East. Do we really want to change again and move to another conference? And so a year ago, if you would have asked me, I would have said, no, I want to stay in the Big East. I don't want to move to the Big 12. But this year, I think I'm thinking about it a little bit differently now. And I think that's because college sports is changing so rapidly before our eyes. It is just changing so much to where now, if you don't have a seat at the table with the big dogs, you don't really have a seat at all in college sports. And so now I'm thinking it's time. It's time for a move to the Big 12.
Yeah, I think this hasn't been widely talked about enough. And I talked about it in my open, which is essentially that it's now also a revenue sharing sport. We're in a revenue sharing sports world where, you can spend up to 22% of your athletic revenue. So if your revenue in a sport is $80 million and UConn's in the $20 million range, and you're only giving, maybe that 22% isn't what you want to give. And that kind of leads into where kids play. Because as great as our coaching staffs are, with the greatest women's coach of all time in Gino Auriemma, and quite possibly one of the greatest, if not the greatest current coach of all in UConn, in college basketball with Dan Hurley. It's just one of those situations where you just can't give it up. Like I would have a hard time staying in the Big East, and then 3 years from now we're kind of left holding the back.
Exactly. And I think what I'm seeing in some of the discussion among UConn fans is looking at the here and now, and in the immediate future, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. The benefit isn't that great to move to the Big 12 right now. Especially when you think about football having to wait till 2031 the revenue might not be huge. We might have a, partial share initially from the Big 12.
Yep.
So I get in the short term, there's a lot of maybe more questions than there are answers, but you got to think big picture, right? You got to think long term. And I think when you start looking at that and seeing what's happening in college sports, and to your point, the way that revenue works, the NIL situation now, TV rights, I mean, things are just changing so much that I think, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, again, if you don't have a seat at the table in one of these 3 or 4, maybe only 2 at some point, major super
Right.
conferences that are forming, then you really don't have a seat at all in the game. And UConn's got to think long term.
Yeah, and you wrote a little bit about this when I first kind of started talking about this on Tuesday about the 5
Yep.
reasons why it makes sense, or that the Big 12 could happen, and what to look forward to. What's of those 5 reasons? What would you want to have as what's your most compelling reason why it makes sense for UConn outside of the money? We all know that money
Yeah,
is
sure.
the main driver of this, but give us
Sure.
your kind of cliff notes on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, for me, as I've thought about it, I really am intrigued and excited by the challenge of moving to the Big 12. I think the Big East obviously is challenging enough. We love the conference. We love the rivalries, Villanova, St. John's, Marquette. It's great. But the Big 12 is quickly becoming unquestionably the best conference in college basketball. I think in Gary Parrish's latest preseason top 25 and 1, I think he had, I believe, 4 of the top 7 teams were all from the Big 12. And if you added a UConn and potentially a Gonzaga, who I know you've talked about as a potential kind of dance partner for UConn moving to the Big 12, that would be 6 of the top 8 teams in America would be from the Big 12 conference. That's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And I see a lot of fans, I think, reacting to that like, man, why would we want to go there? It's going to be so hard to play in the Big 12, and we're not going to be able to have the kind of success that we've had in the Big East. And I just think that's crazy, especially for a program that is led by none other than Dan Hurley, right? Who has never seen a mountain that he doesn't want to climb, right? And I think he would be motivated by that. I think he would fire up the players in the program and the fan base and recruits to go after that in the Big 12. So that gets me excited.
Yeah, it's almost like you wrote my first segment. That was a big part of one of the reasons, like the why, right? I think when you start to kind of break it down, one of the big reasons I put in there, obviously, again, outside of the money, outside of the current landscape of college basketball, is what's there to entice Dan Hurley to stick around longer than his NBA aspirations, and if to dominate the Big 12 would be an incredible feat for him to do. And I also feel like too, it can kind of give him another area to kind of transform the way not the way he coaches, because that'll never change, but the way he kind of formulates his organization. He talks about that word all the time. The organization is strong. Well, you're going to need a lot more players, and you're going to have to be deeper. You're probably not going to be able to go 7-8 deep in the Big 12 in the future, right? You're going to have that 10 11 guys deep, and that's something they've talked about already. So I kind of wondered, maybe these talks have been happening for quite a bit of time with Dan Hurley, because I know he's close with Dave Benedict, where he's just like, hey, if this is imminent, whether it's this year, next year, 2 years from now, I got to start bolstering up this roster with, we're seeing a lot more 5 and 4 stars interested in UConn. So that's all conjecture, but I think it makes sense.
Absolutely. And, I've been getting some pushback on X today. I know you're familiar with that sort of thing, Mark.
Never happens.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody's real friendly on X these days.
Yeah. No one's ever angry or opinionated.
That's right. That's why as a pastor, I feel like the UConn fan base needs a pastor. We need some spiritual counseling, maybe, because we're a little emotionally unbalanced sometimes as UConn fans.
Maybe, yeah, maybe that's true.
Yeah.
No, and I guess you also mentioned this, and we're going to talk about it. Maybe we'll talk about it in the next segment, but I'll bring it up now quickly, which is the different venues, like the areas that we would go play. Dream matchup. Which if Big 12 happens, they're meeting today. So I have again, to kind of give this to everybody that's watching, Ross Dellinger is going to come on the show tomorrow. He's the guy who's literally been all over this for the last probably 18 months. So we're going to talk to him tomorrow. We're recording it tonight, but it'll be out tomorrow morning. So I don't know if there's anything that's going to be announced in that time frame, but it seems a lot closer than what people are really trying to lead on. So if it's imminent, as I've been told, what's your favorite matchup for the basketball team?
Well, so I'm in Colorado. I live in Colorado, and I'll share my story later as far as how I became a UConn fan. It's kind of an interesting story, but so I'm obviously biased to being able to travel 45 minutes down the road and see my Huskies play in Boulder. That would be fantastic. And I'm actually a CSU grad, Colorado State, so I already hate the Buffs anyways. So to see UConn roll into Boulder and dominate the Buffs would just be a dream come true for me. So that's up there pretty high. But I would love to get to Lawrence, Kansas, and watch UConn and KU showdown, often, hopefully most every year. I know they played this last year, but to have that be a regular conference matchup, a conference rivalry, like I just think that'd be so good for both programs, for college basketball. So I would love to head out to Kansas for a UConn KU matchup. What about you? Well, what's your favorite matchup?
I said that would be the best college basketball conference matchup, bar none, day in, day out. Yep. Kansas UConn. But what I would be looking forward to the most, because I think it would get crazy eyeballs. And if you don't think this is part of the proposal, I know it's small, but it all helps.
Yeah.
The Hurley Bowl. You have to, it's prime time. Danny versus Bobby, Arizona State, UConn, home and home. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. Both of them psychos on the sideline screaming at their players with love. I think that's my dream scenario.
Yeah. And again, like what UConn fans, like, can't we get excited about a January or a February trip, whether we're coming from Colorado or Connecticut, to Arizona, to Tempe, right? And stay down the road in Scottsdale, play a couple rounds of golf, watch the Hurley Bowl. Like, sign me up for that, right? How can we not be excited for that?
I couldn't agree more. We're going to talk about Jeff and how he became a UConn fan, and we'll give you guys a little break from the Big 12 talk coming up after this. Sorry, guys, got to pay some bills. Let's put on 5 Hour Energy. 5 Hour Energy. You need a quick pick-me-up to get you through your busy day? 5 Hour Energy has been the go-to for that for 20 years, giving people just the boost you need, whether you're grabbing a shot at the store or stocking up on multi-packs. It's always within reach. And guess what? Right now, you can snag 20% off 5hourenergy.com with their promo code LOCKEDONCFB. But hurry, this deal is only good until September 30th. Head to 5hourenergy.com. Keep your energy up and have a great day. All right, we're back with Jeff Dillon, and you're on Locked On UConn. All right, Jeff, you're a writer. How would you describe the UConn fan base?
Wow. Well, I think earlier I said we're emotionally unbalanced, which is true. I think a better way to say it is we're passionate. The UConn fan base is so passionate. And when I became a UConn fan as a kid, I didn't fully understand it because, of course, Twitter and social media wasn't a thing back then. But certainly watching it on TV, the crowds, the way the fan base supports this team and this program. And now with social media, being able to connect with other fans and see the passion. I mean, again, anything you post about UConn online is going to get a ton of support and pushback, just people that have passionate opinions about it. And one of the things that I love about UConn in general is I think we have this underdog complex. And that kind of plays into my own story of why I fell in love with the program. But I just think we're always like punching up, right? And even after back-to-back national championships, we still feel like the underdog. And I actually posted a quote from Jim Calhoun a couple weeks back on X, where he talks about that, how he's the perpetual underdog. And he said something to the effect of, if I'm not the underdog, I will find a way to make myself the underdog. And I think that's a great description of UConn, of the program, and of our fan base. Like, we just love playing the underdog role and proving people wrong and going after the big dogs any way that we can. And so even though we are one of the big dogs now, we're always going to have that underdog persona. And I love that.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you. I think, what's interesting to me is I think we're a passionate fan base. So I agree with you that there's some kind of almost like emotional instability, but I think that also comes with, and I'll throw myself out there, because when I watch a game, I'm lucky that I have children who have seen me go crazy over a game, so they're not scared of dad when he watches a basketball game, because I know that's,
yes,
some people's reality. They have to kind of sit there with their hands folded and not
Yep.
and not go crazy. But my kids will go
Yep.
and cheer me on.
Yeah.
If daddy's going crazy. So it's one of those things. What I think sometimes it does get to. I think what a Dan Hurley obnoxious as can't say the S word on our show. So that's what he's called
Yep.
us in the past. So on social. So I don't disagree. And I think when we're all united for a cause, like you just said, an underdog complex.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know how old you are. I think we're probably a little closer in age than some of the younger fans. You're right on that. Like, that's why during like the tournament, even though they've been so inevitably great over the last 2 years, you still kind of get those butterfly feelings and an uneasiness about watching an NCAA tournament game. They've made it look easier than it really should be. Let's be honest,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
So that's kind of an interesting dichotomy that UConn fans have right now. We have this kind of like God complex where we're on top of the world, but then there's still that kind of like, but we, are we, we're trying to be the underdog, the dream season team. Like, there's definitely an aspect of that. So it's a really hard fan base to kind of pin down into like a phrase.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's a great way to sum it up. And I think that's why Dan Hurley is such it's like he's like a laboratory designed person to lead this program and to be the face of UConn right now, because he's got that, right? Like, he's got that persona. Like, no matter how much success he has, no matter how many incredible legendary programs and organizations are calling for him to come take their job, he still feels like he's one step away from utter failure and utter disaster, right? And that motivates him. And
for sure,
I think the UConn fan base has that as well, where it's just like, and I think that even plays into some of the Big 12 talk too, where we've tasted failure. We've tasted years of just irrelevance in college basketball and in other sports as well. The women's program less so, but we've tasted what that's like, and we do not want to go there again. And that pushes us, that pushes the program. And I think that motivates the fan base as a whole.
For sure. Just to let everyone know, college football is back, and the Locked On College Football podcast kicks off with action with the live season preview at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, September. I think I did the wrong promo, but that's okay. Check out the Locked On College Football podcast. It is a discussion with the ACC, Big 10, Big 12. See, we're all the four major conferences, and with all these teams that have a shot at the expanded college football playoff. Host will be involved, including myself, maybe, if the Big 12 adds UConn, even though UConn won't be added into the Big 12 until 2031. But it's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Go check out the College Football Podcast. Jeff, you're a UConn fan. How did that happen? And then I'm going to ask you some fun who do you want questions here.
Awesome. Yeah, so I was a kid growing up in Northern Colorado, and in the early 2000s, the early 90s actually, and man, I wish it was the early 2000s, but it was the early 90s, and we didn't have really a banner college basketball program around here. CU had a couple good years. CSU, my alma mater, really hadn't accomplished much. They've done better recently, but basketball was my favorite sport. It was my favorite sport to play. And I wanted my own college basketball team, my team, and all my buddies and my brother, were cheering for UNC because of Jordan, and Duke because they were having all the success, some Kentucky and Kansas in there. And I'm a younger brother. I'm a younger sibling, and I've always had that underdog complex. And I just wanted a different team, I didn't want to cheer for the bandwagon teams, the UNCs and the Dukes. And so I was looking for a team. And I remember one day, probably 94, 93, 94, and I was watching and saw UConn playing. And I've always loved dogs. I loved dogs when I was a kid. So I love the old school mascot.
Sure.
And loved watching this team play. And they had this young player named Doron Sheffer, who I just loved watching play, guard that played the game in such a smooth, smart way. And I wanted to pattern my game after him, which is funny because I was always tall for my schools growing up. So I was always in the post, whether I wanted to be or not, but I wanted to play with like Doron Sheffer. And then of course it was Ray Allen and Donnie Marshall and Travis Knight and Coach Calhoun. And I just fell in love with the Huskies and decided that this is going to be my team. And what I didn't know at the time is like, I could not have picked a better program, right? That was like the beginning of the glory days. And as they started to have more success, it just became easier and easier and more fun to be a UConn fan. So I've been a diehard Huskies fan ever since.
Okay. So I was gonna add, I think we already know the answer. Then that's a great story, by the way. I love Doron Sheffer. He's one of my favorite players of all time. The Duff, I go back to the Duff Hennefeld, so that's that Israeli pipeline that Calhoun created. So which doesn't have to be a championship team. Which is your favorite team of all time on the men's side?
Man, yeah, that's such a good question. It's such a hard question.
It
but
is.
I think if I think if I had to pick one, I'd go back to 99, and that championship, I've written about it, that championship was so meaningful to me as a kid and validating my UConn fanhood,
Sure.
all my friends were like, UConn, like nobody cheers for UConn, right? And they have this incredible season, Rip Hamilton and Ricky Moore and all those guys, and they get to the championship game against this vaunted Duke team, Shane Battier, Elton Brand, and they're huge underdogs. And once again, everybody's counting them out. And for UConn to triumph and win that game, Jim Calhoun's first championship, the first championship in program history, it was validating, and it was really kind of a culmination of all those years for the program building and those years for me as a fan, that I'll never forget it. I think I wore my UConn shirt at church or at school and church probably for probably a month afterwards, just bragging about UConn being the champs. And it sort of proved that they were legit, and I was legit as a UConn fan. So I got to go with that first championship team.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. That's my favorite team as well. Close second is that 89-90 team, because that's the team I grew up on. That's my childhood when I was kind of like the sports awakening, if you will. So no, but 99, getting to know Ricky Moore now, it's been a pretty cool experience. All right, last question for you before we go. I recently bought a minivan. I do this to every guest. I bought a minivan for my family because we have another arrival coming to our family, and you have now been bestowed my Kia Carnival. You're driving. You can put 4 UConn players or coaches behind you. You can have 1 shotgun and then 3 behind you in my minivan. You got to drive cross country. Who are the 4 players that you're choosing, or coaches?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. So former or current, we can go.
Doesn't matter. Good, yeah.
Right? Yeah. Man, that is a fantastic question, Mark. That's why you're on Locked On UConn. That's good stuff. I think I'd have to go. I got to have Calhoun and Hurley in there. Like, I just have to. I got to be able to talk to both those guys, to hear them interact. Anytime I see them, a video of them interacting, it's just hilarious to me. Just like 2 ultra competitive guys that have built this program. So would love to have them in there. I'm gonna take Sue Bird from the women's side as well.
Love it.
And part of that, my girls, I've got 4 girls, and they're getting into watching the UConn women's team. And I've showed them some old videos. Those were some of my favorite women's teams back in the early 2000s. So I'd love to have Sue Bird in there to represent the women's side of things. And then my last one, man, this is tough. I feel like I need to phone a friend or something. Is that allowed on here?
No,
Man, I think I might have to go with Khalid El-Amin, right? Like that dude is just fun. And I feel like he could tell some amazing stories about those glory days in the 90s and that championship game against Duke. So let's get El-Amin in there with us too.
I love it. He's my favorite player of all time.
Is he really?
Not the greatest player of all time. I always make that distinction, but to me, I'm built like Khalid El-Amin. And so when I played basketball, I was kind of like, that stocky kid, 5'10", 5'11", maybe 6 foot with some lifted shoes. So that's my guy. Khalid El-Amin was always my favorite when and he's probably not much older than me, but at the same time, when he came to UConn, I was like, man, that's my guy right there. So has always been one of my favorite players of all time, if not the favorite. So I love that. I also love the number 40, number 42 on like a smaller, shorter guy. Just for some reason, I think that looks cool.
Yep.
I wore 55 as a high school player. And so there's just something cool about that. But listen, man, I really appreciate you coming on. Can you let people know where they can find your stuff? Obviously, we have your X handle on here at Dillon with Life. But if you want to tell people where they can find your writing and subscribe.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it. Yeah, on X at Dillon with Life. That's kind of the main spot. I'm also on Medium. They can find the link on X for that as well. And working on putting together a Substack for the basketball season. So more to come there. But follow me on X and you'll get all that information. So Dillon with Life on X, and would love to talk, maybe even argue UConn Huskies with anyone. Sounds like fun.
Sure, man. Well, thanks for coming. This has been another episode of Locked On UConn. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, with Jeff Dillon, asking you to stay connected. Make sure your toughness meter is always rising. And as always, go Huskies.